Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this briefing on what's going on in Japanese politics. My name is Timothy Langley. Today is December 21st, 2023. Today, we'd like to give you a briefing on what's happening with the current scandal that's attacking Japanese politics. I'm joined by my colleague, Dan Harada. Dan is a long-term veteran of Japanese politics. He is a regular fixture within the LDP and within what's going on in Nagatacho. I'm very happy to be joined by Dan. We're going to give you a dual briefing today on the political scandal that's attacking the Prime Minister and several individual political factions that are guiding Japanese politics. Several weeks ago, we were in the middle of an extraordinary diet session that ended on the 13th, which was just last week. And at that point in time, we were mostly talking about the Unification Church with money that was going to be distributed to people to help them through a tough economic time, different subsidies that were being devoted for gasoline and that sort of thing. And just 3 weeks ago, it arose that a political professor, a political science professor in Kobe Gakushin University had identified a discrepancy between the amount of political funds that were generated by the various political factions that make up the LDP and the amount of money that was reported to tax officials for the money that they amassed. So in Japanese politics, as most people know, there is fundraising that is done throughout the year, usually in the form of book publishing parties or Hagemasukai's encouragement parties, or actually seminars that are the most popular venue. And people, it's like in many countries, $100 a plate dinner or a $500 a plate dinner. In Japan, it's usually a 100 ichimayen or nimayen, rarely more than nimayen. For a political briefing that you get, you need to be invited, you need to be kind of vetted to join these. But the entry rate is not that high. It's mostly Japanese business executives. I myself go to probably 5 a week, usually breakfast briefings. Sometimes, rarely it's a lunchtime briefing, and more frequently it's an evening briefing with cocktails and finger food. Dan probably is at one of these every day, 2 or 3 of them perhaps. So it's part and parcel of how Japanese politics runs, and it's one of the ways that these political factions are able to collect legitimately funds. And what happened with the Gakushin University professor who was doing the analysis is he noticed this disturbing discrepancy with the amount of funds that were being collected and those that were being reported. So the Japanese political funds control law allows this kind of activity to happen. It's just that the political parties and individuals need to report the money that has come in, the money that they spent for the venue, and then the amount of money that they've gained as kind of revenue. And this scandal broke very quickly and caught fire really, really rapidly. And it's just been the span of 3 weeks. We've had several ministers of the cabinet resign. The chief cabinet secretary was the first to fall last week. And at the end of the diet session, now the public prosecutors can go and question the members of the parliament. But in the meantime, ever since this story first broke, they have been talking to the secretaries, to the accountants and that sort of thing, and collecting a lot of information. So it's a really bustling scandal now. It is shaking the LDP to the core, and there's much more in store. But Dan and I wanted to give you a briefing on where we are right now and how this thing started. So Dan, can you tell us a little bit about how this whole thing, how we got here in the first place, the political funding, and how this the machinations of reporting and non-reporting happened?
Well, we go back several years ago. We go back into the Abe administration. And Mr. Abe several times interfered with the inner workings of the police department, changing the retirement age and so on and so forth. And that was a grudge which the police has and had. And the police said, well, we'll wait for the occasion, and one day we will get back to you. And that day has arrived.
There's been a lot going on with the public prosecutor's office, and they've been keeping their powder dry just when such an opportunity came up. So they were approached by the Gakushin University professor because he actually filed a criminal complaint. How rare is that? How suspicious is it that this university professor from Kobe would come up with this kind of information and lodge actually a criminal complaint for violation of the political funding law?
The newspaper, the daily newspaper of the Communist Party, published an article some time ago saying that there were some discrepancies. And the professor whom you're referring to decided to look into it and found, as you say, the discrepancies between the income, the expenses, and what is left over.
One of the things I find very interesting about this whole thing is that it didn't just start with Mr. Abe. I think many of the stories now being reported claim that it started with Mr. Mori when he was prime minister. And at that time, I mean, you and I have been doing this for a long time, Dan, but in the old days, maybe 20 years ago, the Abe faction was one of the factions that was controlling Japanese LDP politics. And after the Mori administration, the LDP began to be more and more dominated by the faction, Seiwakai faction. And it was somewhat mysterious. I thought it was just popularity and personality, although I didn't attribute it to the personality of Mr. Mori. But he is known to be very effective in collecting funds. And they attribute the root of this kind of disease that is actually filtered throughout all of the LDP factions, since apparently the Abe faction was particularly successful at collecting funds, at hosting these huge parties, and not paying for everything and squirreling it away. I mean, we had that going on even with the Sakura o Mirukai that got Mr. Abe into so much trouble too.
No, that's absolutely right. Everybody is now moving into the past story with Mr. Mori, and clearly he originated the process of receiving funds and not reporting them and then distributing it back to the members. So he is now almost every day in the media, and I agree with you that he is the originator of the scandal.
And just for full disclosure to the audience, Dan, you are very close to the Abe faction. I'm very close to the Abe faction. I have many friends who are members there. I have lots of friends who are diet secretaries. The fellow who hired me out of law school when I first joined the staff of the LDP was also in the Abe faction, Nakayama Taro. And so for 35 years, I've been rubbing shoulders with these people. And similarly to you, we're not trying to cast stones, and we certainly don't want to burn bridges in making this report to you, but it is such a huge scandal that really is rocking what's going on in Japanese politics today, and could potentially bring down even the Kishida administration, but certainly it's going to damage at least one of the main factions that make up the LDP, Dan.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And we have not seen the end of it. You have to realize that the police cannot really act while the Diet is in session. So the Diet is not in session now, and they're going all out. And depending when the January session begins, whether it's early January or late January, that will give some extra time to the investigators to work. And clearly, as I said earlier, they have a grudge against Mr. Abe himself, and by extension, against his faction. And they will not give up until they really hand 1, 2, 3, 4 big fish.
Right. So talking about the main players in this whole scenario, it also includes the public prosecutor's office, 99 members of the Abe faction. So apparently the main violator of this, maybe you can call it a scheme, this tactic where you collect money and you distribute some to the members and you don't report it and you tell them not to report it. So it's kind of under the table money. It's been going on for at least 10 years. And for the Abe faction, 99 members there, the number of public prosecutors that are required, this is just one faction, and they've identified 4 factions that are involved in that. And of these factions, the Abe faction has the largest number and probably the largest amount of money that has been collected and distributed. I mean, every time we go to an Abe faction Hagemasu-kai or Benkyo-kai, there's always 1,000 people there. And similarly with Mr. Motegi. Mr. Motegi, as the Secretary General of the LDP, he'll have 3,000. I've been to several of his briefings, excellent briefings, by the way. He always has documents that he distributes to the people who participate, a very high-level geopolitical and very succinct briefing that goes for exactly 1 hour. But Mr. Motegi is the head of his faction, even though he is also Secretary General. There's nothing wrong with that. Mr. Nikai is the head of his faction. He is also implicated. He is the head of his faction. Mr. Kishida, until this scandal broke, was the head of his faction, which is somewhat unusual in Japanese political history. Usually when the prime minister becomes the prime minister. He relinquishes his leadership over the faction that helped get him into the prime minister's position in the first place. The prime minister didn't do that, unusually. He wanted to keep hold on that. I can kind of understand why, because of all of the factions. His was the fifth largest, so he had other people in a higher pecking order who wielded a little bit more political power than his political faction did. So in becoming prime minister, he needed to do a lot of horse trading, but also the use of these funds that have been squirreled away into the faction headquarters and also distributed to, gosh, the players. These are the main leaders that we talk about who get the choice spots. The foreign ministry, the Ministry of Education, these chief cabinet portfolios. The finance ministry has not been touched. Mr. Aso has not been mentioned very vociferously yet. But these are the main players, and I think it's going to have a shakeout that doesn't infect just the Abe faction, Dan.
Well, the police, on somebody's orders, have only focused on two factions. So that means that there are three others that are so far left untouched.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not by coincidence. It has been rumored that the Kishida faction did the same thing as the other two. And the Kishida faction, for some reason, has not been investigated by the police. And the question is why? And you can easily get an answer.
Sure.
And the other two factions, well, let's say the police hasn't touched them yet. But this is going to go deep, deep, deep until at least sometime in January, before the diet session opens.
Well, one can anticipate that the space between the ground and the bus is going to be really crowded with a lot of people taking blame for this, maybe rightly so. But Mr. Kishida did do a house cleaning that really identified the Abe administration or the Abe faction more so than it did anybody else. He cleaned out all of the cabinet officials who were in the Abe faction, and he cleaned out the vice ministers as well. And I think that there's a lot of animosity directed towards him as a consequence of going through this without a scalpel, more like with an axe. And so it does kind of beef up his position in a twisted kind of way, but it does create another 99 enemies for the prime minister going forward.
You are absolutely correct. He has made as many enemies as he could possibly have. And at the same time, and you are correct, his standing within the party has not gone down. If anything, it has got slightly up. But again, let's see what happens before the session of the Diet opens. How far will the police go in investigating?
So just keying off of what you've just said, Dan, it's interesting to me, and I think it should be to other political observers, that in spite of the LDP taking this hit and the opinion polls really hammering the prime minister and his cabinet and the LDP, the numbers for the opposition parties are not being reflected upwards. In previous scandals, the opposition parties seem to come up in appreciation or in affection from the voting population. That hasn't happened this time.
No, it has the difference between when Diminto lost power more than 10 years ago, there was a big united opposition party. Now we do not have that. There are several little opposition parties.
Yeah.
And you also have to see when the Diet session that begins in January, the opposition party may find a common ground to attack the prime minister and therefore the LDP. So they haven't had that opportunity yet because the session has closed, but it will open again.
Before going on much further, I want to talk about what's going on right now. You opened the newspapers yesterday and today, and it's just really shocking revelations. But before we get into that, I've got to remark how splendidly the Communist Party has held itself as the hearings have been going on in the parliament, the writings that they've published on this ongoing scandal, and how they have performed. Even though they're the smallest of all the opposition parties, they have really been on the money this time, haven't they?
Yeah, you're correct. And again, as I said earlier, they, or specifically their newspapers, brought the thing to light.
Yeah.
So you are correct. It is not a large party, but it is wielding a lot of power.
So Can you give us a little bit of an insight into what's going on now? What's happened over the last 48 hours that should be of interest to our audience today in figuring out what's going to be happening next?
Well, the police started yesterday to investigate the Diet members themselves. Up to now, they investigated the secretaries and this and that and the other thing, but from yesterday on, it's the very one person. And they have a list. They have now more than 100 inspectors in Tokyo. They came from all over Japan to help their Tokyo colleagues. And they are not going to stop at one Diet member. They're going to go to about 20 Diet members. That's why they need the personnel. And they are not going to go to one Diet member and say, we ask you today and that is over. They will go again and again and again. And the investigation is enormous.
I don't know if it's a part of the Japanese culture or maybe political decorum, but when these guys are questioned, even they've been captured by swarms of reporters, and I'm sure the same thing is happening with the public prosecutor's office. They spill the beans pretty quickly. They say, no, I did accept that money. I was told to keep my mouth shut. I was told that this has been going on, and they're very descriptive about what they've been doing and how they've been doing it. And I imagine the public prosecutor's office have very thick files to work on.
Well, we already have 1, 2, 3 Diet members that have actually done what you just said. Yes, I did it. Yes, I received black money. And out of the 20 of whatever that will be investigated, more will follow the same route and say yes.
So generally speaking, for the LDP, which is comprised of these 6 political factions, this administration is now headed by Mr. Kishida, who has just recently given up his leadership of the Kishida Faction. It seems that this is going to be shaking the foundation of his administration moving forward. One could actually say that his hand has been strengthened because the main thorn in his side has always been the Abe administration, with or without Mr. Abe at the leadership. Even without Mr. Abe, he had to deal with 6 other people who were in a consortium of leaders. And with 99 members, he really needs to confer with them. He needs to get their buy-in. And that's why you had this triumvirate with Mr. Aso, Mr. Motegi, and Mr. Kishida kind of trying to guide Japanese politics and pushing bills through. But you have this other elephant in the room that's kind of leaderless. It's not essentially, it is not leaderless, but it's different from the other political factions because they really don't, I don't know if it's accurate to say they don't have their act together, but they certainly don't have one voice that they can speak with who is carrying, the personality and the conviction that one of the normal faction leaders holds. So the curious thing is how this is going to shape the LDP, within the next, 6 months or so. I mean, can the Kishida administration even survive that?
Well, there is one date that you must keep in mind. Sunday, April the 28th. There will be some by-election. There will definitely be a by-election because one of the Diet members has passed away, and that automatically triggers an election. But from the police investigation, it is most likely that some, whatever it's 1, 2, 3, or 10 members of the Diet would give up their seat, which will trigger a by-election, I repeat, on Sunday, April the 28th. And then the voters will have their choice, throw the LDP out or whatever. But that is the key date.
I think there's plenty of time between now and then. The Diet member who died was Mr. Hosoda, who was previously Speaker of the House, and previous to that, he was the head of the Abe Faction. So if the public prosecutors want to go after the faction and who the violators are, after Mr. Mori, it was Mr. Abe, and after Mr. Abe, it was Mr. Hosokawa. And Mr. Abe and Mr. Hosokawa have passed this life, so who are they going to blame? And it looks like it's the 5 who were in the leadership because each of them have been very close to the money, counting and guiding the faction. So definitely the Abe faction is going to suffer big time from this, don't you think?
The Abe faction will no longer exist as it is now. There are people inevitably who are going to be indicted, and there are a number of younger politicians, when they go home for the weekend and speak to their followers, the followers said, "You are a member of the Abe faction, and the Abe faction is a bad boy, they did dirty things and so on, so why are you still in that faction?" And that will trigger a snowball of many people leaving the faction. And so the equilibrium which you have referred to, with the mammoth Abe faction with close to 100 people, and the next faction with almost 50, so twice as many, that equilibrium will be finished. But as I repeat, you have to see at the end of the day, what will the voters look for, and how will they judge that whole entire incident? Sunday, April 28th.
Well, as it stands right now, the Abe faction consists of 26% of all LDP members, and they are not represented in the cabinet anywhere close to 26%. I don't know if it's zero, but it's probably pretty close to zero. And at the vice ministerial level, it's also like that. That's happened within the span of a week, Dan. It's just people frequently complain about when they study what's going on in Japan, whether it's technology or business or finance or politics. Nothing happens. It's so slow. Things move so slowly there. But this change here, it's so tectonic and it's happened so rapidly that I think the reverberations are going to be felt really quickly in a very big way.
Yes, I mean, you're right. We never had a police team of over 100 detectives looking into a thing like this. This is enormous. It has never happened before. We have had scandals of substantial political influence. We have Recruit, we have Sagawa, and so on. But nothing on the scale that we are up to now.
Before we tie this up, Dan, there's always been this question of who, if it's not Mr. Kishida, who is it? And the general consensus is, well, there's nobody else. You know, nobody else can fill his shoes. We hear that all the time. Whenever there's a potential change, everybody falls back on, well, there's nobody else that can do it. So let's just stick with the person who's doing the job right now. And I don't think that that's going to work this time. You've got a couple of people in the realm of possible candidates for prime minister who are untouched. You've got some people. Mr. Suga doesn't have a faction, for example. Mr. Ishiba is squeaky clean. You've got Sanai Takaichi, who also doesn't belong to a faction. You've got Konotaro, who is not a faction leader. He is in the Aso faction, but somehow pushed aside a little bit. So these fellows who are kind of in the wings, now it seems like they're going to be coming up in prominence. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, Ishiba-san has started to move. He has made several comments on TV and so on. And the weaker Mr. Kishida begins. But as you said earlier, your point is very well taken. The LDP is down, but surprisingly, out of all this, Mr. Kishida is doing not so bad compared to what he was doing before this thing erupted. So again, I repeat, we have to see what the public says. And the public will have a say on Sunday, 28th April. And from then on, we'll see what happens, whether Kishida-san resigns, whether he doesn't resign. Until then, let the police work and see what they come up with.
So as usual with Japanese politics, frequently it is the hidden hand of mysterious forces that kind of guides things. You anticipate something's going to happen, yet something else comes out, and things are swept under the carpet, and we move forward because that was ancient history of 2 weeks ago, and we're moving forward now. And possibly that is the scenario that's going to happen this time too. But for those of you who are in the audience that are interested in this sort of thing, we really appreciate you tuning in today. And also, if you're in Tokyo, Dan Harada, I mean, much of the learnings that I've had, the familiarity I've gained, has been through Dan Harada. He holds a breakfast briefing once a month. It's under the name of the Nagatacho Forum. It is downtown. It's a breakfast briefing. If you are interested in this kind of insight, it's a 1 hour briefing, starts at maybe 7:30 or 8 o'clock. It gets out at 9 o'clock, always on a Thursday morning. Please write to Dan. Here's his email here, and get yourself an invitation to that. I've been going to Dan Harada's breakfast for what, Dan, 35 years. Ever since you first started it, I've been a religious
That's
participant.
wrong.
Yes, and I genuinely appreciate everything you've done and all the tutelage you've shared with me. And alternatively, ladies and gentlemen, there's a weekly briefing that I give on Sunday mornings. It's a tight, maybe 30-minute briefing on what's going on in Japanese politics now that's important. It is broadcast on LinkedIn and on Clubhouse. It's uploaded to YouTube. Here are the sites where you can sign in for that. There's no sign up for it. It is just a free flow of information. We have a question and answer period. After that, it usually runs all in total about 90 minutes. The briefing itself is about 30 or 35 minutes. But if this is the sort of thing you like, please continue to join. We appreciate that you're interested in Japanese politics, just like we are. Japanese politics is the grist of how the economy moves, how the culture moves. It's just so essential to understand what's going on, who's on first base, who's on second base. We appreciate you tuning in. Thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed this series. Please continue to stay tuned with us. Dan, thank you very much for joining.
Delighted. Thank you very much indeed. Please keep tuned and look at Sunday, 28th of April. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Maya.